In 1901, sponge divers off the coast of a tiny Greek island pulled something from the seafloor that would quietly shatter everything we thought we knew about ancient technology. Corroded, encrusted, broken into fragments, it looked like nothing. For decades, it sat in a museum drawer, dismissed as a lump of bronze. But when scientists finally peered inside, they found gears, precision gears. A mechanical computer built 2,000 years before the first mechanical computers were supposed to exist. Tonight, we're going to sink into the mystery of the Antikythera mechanism, a device so impossibly advanced that some believe it could only have come from a civilization history forgot to mention. Let the waves carry you back through time. The Aegean Sea in the spring of 1901 was the color of dreams, that impossible blue that exists nowhere else on Earth. And beneath its surface, the sponge divers of the Greek islands had worked for generations, descending into the depths the way their fathers and grandfathers had before them, learning the seafloor the way farmers learn their fields, knowing every rock and crevice and shadow where the sponges grew fat and valuable. Captain Dimitrios Kondos and his crew had been working the waters near Crete when a storm pushed them toward shelter, and they found themselves anchored off the tiny island of Antikythera, a forgotten speck of rock that sat in the strait between Crete and the Peloponnese, a place where the currents ran strong and the waters dropped away into darkness. The storm passed, but the captain was a practical man, and he saw no reason to waste the anchorage. So he sent his divers down to see what the unfamiliar seafloor might offer, and among them was a young man named Elias Stadiatis, who would become the first person in nearly 2,000 years to lay eyes on what waited below. The diving suits of that era were heavy canvas affairs, reinforced with rubber, weighted with lead boots and a copper helmet that sat upon the shoulders like something from a medieval nightmare. And as Stadiatis descended, he would have felt the pressure building against his chest, the water pressing in from all sides, the world above growing distant and dim. The air came through a long hose connected to a hand pump on the surface, and with each breath, he could hear the hiss and whisper of his own survival being delivered to him from the world of light and air that grew further away with every meter of his descent. Sunlight fades quickly in water, and what begins as crystal clarity soon softens into a blue-green twilight, the colors draining away one by one until everything exists in shades of grey and green and shadow. Stadiatis sank through this fading world, the weight of his boots pulling him down, the sea floor rising up to meet him like something from a dream. And when his feet finally touched bottom at perhaps 50 meters depth, he found himself in a silence so complete that he could hear his own heartbeat thudding in his ears. The cold at that depth is a presence of its own, seeping through the canvas suit, settling into the bones. And in that cold and that silence, Stadiatis turned to survey his surroundings and saw something that made no sense at all. Shapes emerged from the murk, pale forms scattered across the seafloor. And as he moved closer, his lamp revealed what appeared to be bodies, dozens of bodies, naked and still and tangled together in the attitudes of death. His heart must have hammered against his ribs as he stumbled forward, the lead boots making his movements clumsy and slow. And it was only when he drew close enough to touch them that he understood what he was seeing. They were statues, bronze and marble figures that had lain undisturbed on the seafloor for centuries. their surfaces encrusted with coral and sea growth, but their forms still beautiful, still human, still reaching out with arms and turning with graceful poses that spoke of the artists who had made them long ago. Stadiatis did not stay to investigate further, but gave the signal to be pulled up, rising through the water column as fast as his tenders could haul. And when he broke the surface and they lifted the helmet from his shoulders, he could barely speak for the strangeness of what he had witnessed. His first words to Captain Kondos, delivered in gasping breaths as he clutched the gunwale of the boat, described a heap of dead, naked people lying on the bottom of the sea. The captain might have dismissed this as nitrogen narcosis, the madness of the deep that sometimes afflicted divers who went too far down. But Kondos was a curious man, and he decided to see for himself. When he descended and found the same field of ancient sculptures scattered across the seafloor, he understood immediately that they had found something extraordinary, something valuable beyond measure, something that would change all of their lives. They had discovered, entirely by accident, the largest and most significant underwater archaeological site that had ever been found. The wreck of an ancient ship that had gone down in these waters more than 2,000 years before, and had waited in the darkness all that time for someone to find it again. The ship itself had been a massive vessel, perhaps 40 meters from stem to stern, the kind of heavy cargo carrier that the Romans used to transport goods across the Mediterranean in the final decades of their republic. When archaeologists later studied the site, they determined that the wreck dated to approximately 70 to 60 BCE, a period when Rome was in the midst of its transformation from republic to empire, when Julius Caesar was rising to power and the old order was beginning to crack and crumble under the weight of ambition and civil war. The cargo that the ship had carried told its own story, a story of conquest and desire and the insatiable Roman appetite for Greek culture and Greek beauty. There were bronze statues of gods and athletes, their muscles still defined beneath the patina of age, their faces still serene despite centuries beneath the waves. There were marble sculptures that had once adorned temples and public squares, broken now but still magnificent in their fragments. There were amphorae that had once held wine and oil and precious goods, their seals still intact, their contents long since mingled with the salt water that surrounded them. There was jewelry and glassware and objects of daily life that painted a picture of a wealthy cargo, a floating treasury of Greek art being transported westward toward Italy, and the villas of Roman collectors who craved the cultural prestige that Greek art could provide. The theory that emerged over years of study suggested that the ship had likely departed from the eastern Mediterranean, perhaps from the island of Rhodes, which was known for its workshops and its bronze casting, or perhaps from Pergamon in Asia Minor, where the library rivaled Alexandria, and the sculptures were famous throughout the ancient world. The ship had been sailing west, probably bound for Rome itself, or for the port of Puteoli, where wealthy Romans maintained elaborate summer homes, filled with stolen treasures from every corner of their expanding empire. But somewhere in the strait between Crete and the Peloponnese, the ship had met its end, as caught by a storm that came up fast and hit hard, the kind of Mediterranean tempest that could turn the sea into a chaos of waves and wind within hours. Perhaps the cargo shifted in the hold, unbalancing the vessel. Perhaps a wave struck at the wrong angle, and water poured over the gunwale faster than the crew could bail. Perhaps the ship simply broke apart under the strain, its timbers splintering, its cargo spilling out into the churning water as sailors scrambled for anything that might float. However it happened, the ship went down fast, sinking through the water column and coming to rest on a steep underwater slope where the currents were gentle and the sand was soft. The very speed of the sinking may have protected the cargo, burying it quickly beneath sediment that shielded it from the decay and destruction that would have consumed it in shallower waters. And there it lay, year after year, century after century, while empires rose and fell on the lands above, while the ancient world gave way to the medieval and the medieval to the modern, while humanity forgot that such a ship had ever existed, and the treasures it carried passed out of memory entirely. Rome conquered the known world, and then itself collapsed into fragments. Christianity spread across Europe, and the old gods were forgotten. The Renaissance rediscovered classical beauty, and scholars began to piece together what they could of the ancient past from fragments and copies and texts that had survived by chance. And all that time the ship waited in the darkness, patient and still, and then keeping its secrets until the day when a young sponge diver named Elias Stadiatis descended through the blue-green twilight and saw the shapes of statues emerging from the murk. The historical context of the wreck reveals something profound about the ancient world and about the relationship between Rome and Greece that shaped so much of Western civilization. By the time this ship sailed, Rome had been systematically stripping Greece of its cultural treasures for more than a century. The conquest of Greece had been military, but the occupation was cultural, with Roman generals and governors and wealthy private citizens all competing to acquire the finest examples of Greek art and Greek craftsmanship. Lucius Mummius had sacked Corinth in 146 BCE and shipped entire shiploads of sculptures and paintings back to Rome, setting a precedent that would be followed by every ambitious Roman for generations to come. Sulla had looted Athens itself, carrying off treasures that had stood in temples and public spaces for centuries, and the dictator displayed his plunder in triumphal processions that wound through the streets of Rome, while citizens gaped at the beauty of what their armies had stolen. By the time of this particular shipwreck, the looting had become almost industrialized, with workshops in Greece producing copies and originals alike to feed the Roman appetite, with dealers and middlemen facilitating the transport of art across the Mediterranean, with entire ships devoted to nothing but carrying the cultural heritage of Greece to adorn the homes of its conquerors. The irony of this situation is something worth pausing over as you settle deeper into comfort and let the story wash over you like gentle waves. Rome destroyed so much of what Greece had created, burning libraries and melting down bronzes and allowing temples to fall into ruin through neglect and indifference. And yet, Rome also preserved what it stole, housing Greek sculptures in Roman villas where they would survive for centuries, copying Greek texts in Roman libraries where they would be preserved through the chaos of the medieval period, and yes, loading Greek treasures onto ships that would sometimes sink and thereby protect their cargo from all the destruction that would follow on land. The ship that went down off Antikythera was carrying stolen goods. There is no way around that fact. But those stolen goods were preserved by their theft in ways that the originals left behind in Greece were not. Most Greek bronzes were melted down for their metal long ago. Most Greek temples were demolished for their stone. Most Greek paintings have vanished entirely, leaving us with only Roman copies and written descriptions to hint at what was lost. But the bronzes that went down with this ship survived because they sank, because the water protected them, because the sediment buried them, because the centuries passed over them without touching them at all. There is something almost sacred about this, something that feels like the universe conspiring to preserve what humans tried so hard to destroy. And as you breathe slowly and let your thoughts drift, you might find yourself grateful for a storm that blew 2,000 years ago, grateful for a ship that sank, grateful for the patient darkness that kept these treasures safe until we were ready to find them again. When the salvage began in late 1900 and continued through 1901, the divers worked under conditions that would horrify modern archaeologists. There were no underwater cameras, no careful documentation of where each object lay, no attempt to preserve the context that is so crucial to understanding archaeological sites. The divers simply grabbed what they could carry and brought it to the surface, loading the boats with statues and amphorae and objects of all kinds, working against time and weather and the limits of their own bodies. The work was extraordinarily dangerous, and the toll it took was severe. One diver died during the salvage, now his body unable to withstand the repeated descents to such dangerous depths. Two others were permanently paralyzed by decompression sickness, the bends, their blood filling with nitrogen bubbles that destroyed their nervous systems and left them crippled for the rest of their lives. The divers knew the risks, and they dove anyway, motivated by the promise of reward and by the sheer wonder of what they were pulling from the sea. And by the time the salvage ended, they had recovered the largest collection of ancient bronze statues ever found, along with marble sculptures, glass vessels, jewelry, coins, and countless other objects that would transform our understanding of ancient art and craftsmanship. The Greek government took possession of the entire hall and transferred it to the National Archaeological Museum in Athens, where scholars set about the painstaking work of cleaning and cataloguing and studying the treasures that had been pulled from the deep. The bronze statues were the stars of the collection, magnificent figures that had survived with their surfaces largely intact, their details still sharp, their poses still graceful after 2 millennia beneath the waves. There was a bronze youth whose identity is still debated, perhaps Perseus or Paris, whose face is one of the most beautiful to survive from the ancient world. There was a philosopher whose weathered features speak of wisdom and age and the weight of years spent thinking about the nature of the universe. There were fragments of other figures, arms and legs and torsos that hinted at the full glory of what had been lost when the ship went down. These were the treasures that drew attention. Chose the pieces that made headlines and attracted scholars from around the world, the prizes that justified all the danger and expense of the salvage operation. But among the haul, there were other objects, less glamorous, more mysterious, pieces that did not fit neatly into any category and were therefore set aside for later study that somehow never came. One of these overlooked objects was a lump of corroded bronze about the size of a large book, unremarkable in appearance, greenish-brown with age and encrustation, sitting in a wooden box in a museum storeroom where it attracted no attention at all. The lump had been brought up with the other salvage and had been logged into the collection with minimal description, just another piece of corroded metal from the wreck, probably part of a statue or perhaps some kind of fitting from the ship itself. It sat in that box for months, while the more impressive pieces were cleaned and displayed and celebrated, and it might have remained there forgotten for decades more, if not for a Greek archaeologist named Valerios Stais, who was methodically working his way through the collection in May of 1902. Stais was examining the corroded lumps and fragments that had been set aside as unimportant, doing the unglamorous work of scholarship that so often yields the most surprising results. And when he looked closely at this particular piece of bronze, he noticed something that made him catch his breath. Through the corrosion and the encrustation, he could see the unmistakable outline of gears, toothed wheels that meshed together with a precision that seemed impossible for an object supposedly 2,000 years old. Stais reported his discovery to his colleagues, and what followed was years of scholarly argument and dismissal and doubt. The gears must be from a later shipwreck that happened to occur in the same location. The object must have fallen from a more recent ship and settled among the ancient wreckage. It simply could not be as old as the other artifacts, because everyone knew that the ancient Greeks did not have the technology to create such complex mechanical devices. The resistance to Stais's discovery reveals something important about how human minds work, something worth holding gently as you let your body relax and your breathing slow and your thoughts drift towards sleep. We see what we expect to see. When we encounter something that does not fit our existing understanding of the world, we tend not to revise our understanding, but to dismiss the anomaly, to explain it away, to find reasons why it cannot be what it appears to be. The scholars who dismissed the Antikythera mechanism were not stupid or dishonest. They were simply operating within a framework of knowledge that had no room for ancient Greek computers, and so they assumed that any apparent ancient Greek computer must be something other than what it appeared. This is how paradigms work. This is how knowledge sometimes progresses, not smoothly, but in sudden jumps, when enough evidence accumulates that the old framework simply cannot hold and a new understanding breaks through. But paradigm shifts take time, and in the case of the Antikythera mechanism, the time would be measured in decades. And so, the mechanism waited. It waited in its glass case and its quiet drawer while the world changed around it in ways that would have astonished the ancient craftsmen who made it. It waited through the First World War when empires crumbled and millions died in the mud of trenches far from the Aegean Sea. It waited through the turmoil of the interwar years and the rise of new ideologies that promised to remake humanity. It waited through the Second World War when Greece itself was occupied and the museum had to hide its treasures from invaders who might have stolen them all over again. It waited through the recovery and the rebuilding and the transformation of archaeology from treasure hunting to science. And slowly, gradually, over the course of the 20th century, minds curious enough and technology advanced enough began to turn their attention to this strange, corroded object and ask the question that it had been waiting all those years to answer. What are you? What were you made to do? Who made you, and how and why? The answers, when they finally began to emerge, would challenge everything scholars thought they knew about the ancient world and would open up possibilities that no one had imagined. But that is a story for later, a story that will unfold gently as you continue to drift and breathe and let the night carry you toward rest. For now, it is enough to know that the mechanism waited, patient as the sea itself, keeping its secrets until we were ready to hear them. Now, for more than half a century after its recovery from the seafloor, the Antikythera mechanism kept its deepest secrets hidden beneath layers of marine corrosion and mineral deposits. And it was not until a curious and persistent scholar named Derek de Solla Price began his investigations in the 1950s that anyone truly attempted to understand what lay within those encrusted fragments. Price was a historian of science at Yale University, and he possessed that rare combination of technical knowledge and imaginative daring that allowed him to see possibilities where others saw only corroded metal. He spent years examining the fragments, measuring what he could, hypothesizing about what he could not see, and in 1959 he published his first major paper arguing that this was no simple artifact, but rather a sophisticated astronomical calculating device, unlike anything else known from the ancient world. His colleagues were skeptical, as scholars often are, when confronted with claims that challenge established timelines and comfortable assumptions about the past. But Price persisted, and in 1971, he arranged for the mechanism to undergo X-ray imaging using the best technology available at the time. Those ghostly images, pale shadows of bronze revealed through layers of corrosion, showed something that made even the skeptics pause. There were gears inside. Not one or two simple wheels, but an entire system of interlocking toothed gears arranged in configurations that suggested deliberate and complex mechanical purpose. The X-rays were limited by the technology of their era, and many details remained obscured, but Price had seen enough to confirm his intuition. This was a machine. This was a computer built from bronze, 2,000 years before the word computer would be coined. Price published his findings in a landmark 1974 paper titled Gears from the Greeks, and though he would not live to see the full vindication of his work, he had opened a door that could never be closed again. Let yourself breathe slowly now as we move forward through the decades following Price. The mechanism waited in its museum case as technology advanced around it. New imaging techniques were developed for medical diagnosis and industrial inspection. Computers grew smaller and more powerful, and a new generation of researchers began to wonder what modern technology might reveal if applied to this ancient puzzle. In 2005, an international team of researchers launched what they called the Antikythera Mechanism Research Project, bringing together experts from Britain, Greece, and the United States, along with equipment borrowed from the aerospace industry. They used a technique called microfocus X-ray computed tomography, which sounds complicated, but simply means taking thousands of X-ray images from different angles and using computers to assemble them into three-dimensional models of the interior. The resolution was extraordinary, far beyond anything Price could have imagined. And, for the first time, researchers could see the mechanism not as flat shadows, but as a fully realized three-dimensional object with all its internal components mapped and measured. What they saw took their breath away. Inside those corroded fragments lay the remains of at least 30 interlocking bronze gears, each one cut with teeth so fine and so precisely spaced that they meshed together with almost no play or wobble. The main gear alone had 223 teeth, each one averaging about 1.5 millimeters in size, and the precision with which they were cut suggested not amateur experimentation, but the confident hand of a master craftsman working within an established tradition. But the gears themselves were only the beginning of the revelation. As the researchers mapped the internal structure, they discovered mechanical arrangements that seemed to belong to a different era entirely. There was a differential gear system, a configuration that allows two different rotational speeds to be combined or separated, and this was a technology that historians had believed was invented during the Renaissance, some 1500 years after the Antikythera mechanism was built. There was epicyclic gearing, an arrangement where smaller gears rotate around a moving center rather than a fixed axis, which allows for the modeling of complex orbital motions. And most remarkably, there was a pin and slot mechanism, an ingenious little device that converts uniform circular motion into variable speed output, which the ancient maker had used to model the fact that the moon does not move across the sky at a constant rate, but speeds up and slows down depending on its position in its elliptical orbit. This last feature is worth pausing on as you settle deeper into comfort and let these ideas wash over you gently. The moon's orbit is not a perfect circle, but an ellipse, a slightly squashed shape, with the Earth not at the center, but offset to one side. This means that sometimes the moon is closer to Earth and moving faster, and sometimes it is farther away and moving slower. This variation was known to ancient astronomers who had carefully tracked the moon's position over many years and recorded its changing speed. But knowing about this variation and building a mechanical device that accurately reproduces it are two very different things. The pin and slot mechanism in the Antikythera device does exactly this. A small pin mounted off-center on one gear slides back and forth in a slot cut into another gear, and this simple arrangement transforms the constant turning of a crank into the variable motion of the moon. It is elegant. It is brilliant. And it suggests a depth of mechanical understanding that we had no idea the ancient Greeks possessed. The researchers published their findings, and the academic world responded with a mixture of wonder and disbelief. Here was physical proof that ancient craftsmen had achieved a level of mechanical sophistication that would not be matched in Europe until the great cathedral clocks of the 14th century. Here was evidence that the classical world possessed not just philosophical brilliance and artistic genius, but also practical engineering skill of the highest order. And here were questions, so many questions about what else might have existed and what else might have been lost. Now let us imagine the mechanism as it once was, complete and gleaming before the sea claimed it and the centuries corroded it. Picture a wooden case about the size of a large book or a small shoebox, its surfaces covered with bronze plates, inscribed with tiny Greek letters and astronomical scales. On the front is a large circular dial marked with the 12 signs of the zodiac and the 365 days of the Egyptian calendar. Pointers indicate the position of the sun and moon against this celestial backdrop. And as you turn a small crank on the side of the device, these pointers move smoothly across the dial, the sun advancing about 1 degree per day, the moon moving faster in its monthly journey through the constellations. But the front dial is only the most visible feature of the mechanism. Turn the device over and you find 2 more dials on the back, spiral in shape rather than circular, their tracks winding inward like the grooves of a seashell. The upper spiral tracks the Metonic cycle, a period of 19 years after which the phases of the moon repeat on approximately the same days of the solar calendar. This cycle was known to the Babylonians and later adopted by the Greeks for regulating their lunar calendars. And the mechanism could predict the moon's phase on any given day within this 19-year span with remarkable accuracy. A small subsidiary dial within this spiral tracked the Calippic cycle, a refinement of the Metonic cycle that spans 76 years and corrects for small accumulated errors. The lower spiral on the back of the mechanism tracked something even more impressive: the Saros cycle of eclipses. An eclipse occurs when the Sun, Moon, and Earth align in specific ways, and these alignments repeat in a pattern that spans about 18 years. The Babylonian astronomers had discovered this cycle through centuries of careful observation, and the Greek maker of the Antikythera mechanism had encoded it into bronze gears and spiral dials. By turning the crank and reading the inscriptions, an ancient user could predict when lunar and solar eclipses would occur, decades into the future. Imagine the power of such knowledge in a world where eclipses were often seen as omens or divine messages. Imagine being able to tell a king or a priest that the sun would darken on a specific day 3 years hence. Imagine the authority that such predictive power would confer. But there was more still. A small subsidiary dial on the back of the mechanism tracked the 4-year cycle of the Pan-Hellenic Games, the great athletic and religious festivals that brought Greeks together from across the Mediterranean world. The Olympic Games were the most famous of these, but there were others too: the Pythian Games at Delphi, the Nemean Games, the Isthmian Games at Corinth, and all of them were tracked on this small dial so that the user could know which games were being celebrated in any given year. And recent research suggests that the mechanism may have been even more ambitious than this. Inscriptions on the device mention the 5 planets visible to the naked eye: Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. And some researchers believe that the original mechanism included gears to track the positions of these wandering stars as well. If this is true, then the device was not just a lunar and solar calculator, but a complete model of the known cosmos, a miniature clockwork universe that fit in the palm of your hand. Picture yourself now in a quiet room somewhere in the ancient Greek world, perhaps on the island of Rhodes, which some scholars believe was where the mechanism was made. The evening light is fading, and oil lamps cast a warm glow across the workbench. You are a wealthy merchant, or perhaps a scholar, or maybe a priest, responsible for determining the proper dates of religious festivals. Before you sits this remarkable device, gleaming bronze inscribed with astronomical wisdom accumulated over centuries of patient observation. You turn the crank slowly and watch the heavens move. The moon waxes and wanes, the sun travels through the constellations, the planets wander on their complex paths among the fixed stars. You can see into the future. You can know when the moon will darken and when the sun will be swallowed, and when the next Olympic Games will begin. All of this knowledge, compressed into gears and dials, answering to the gentle motion of your hand. This was not a tool for professional astronomers who would have known these cycles by heart. This was something more remarkable still. This was the universe made comprehensible for someone who wanted to understand the heavens without spending a lifetime studying them. This was knowledge democratized, mechanized, made portable and accessible. And this is perhaps what makes the mechanism most remarkable, not just its technical sophistication, but its purpose. Someone in the ancient world believed that ordinary people should be able to understand the motions of the cosmos. Someone believed this knowledge was worth the immense effort of encoding it into a portable mechanical device. Someone believed that the universe could be understood. Now, as your thoughts grow softer and your breathing slows, let us consider the silence that followed. After the Antikythera mechanism sank beneath the waves around 70 BCE, the technology it represented seems to have vanished from the world. We have scattered literary references to astronomical devices and mechanical wonders. Cicero writing about a planetarium that Archimedes built, later authors mentioning celestial spheres and calculating devices. But nothing physical survives. No workshops have been found, no tools, no prototypes, no instruction manuals, no other mechanisms. For 1,500 years, nothing approaching this complexity appears anywhere in the archaeological or historical record. Islamic astronomers built beautiful astrolabes, sophisticated instruments for measuring the positions of stars and solving astronomical problems. But astrolabes are fundamentally different from the Antikythera mechanism. An astrolabe is an analog computer in the sense that it represents celestial relationships through the geometry of its plates and rings, but it contains no gears, no moving parts driven by other moving parts. The Antikythera mechanism is something else entirely. It is clockwork. It is a machine that models time through the meshing of toothed wheels. And this type of technology does not appear again until medieval Europe, when cathedral builders began constructing great astronomical clocks, massive devices that tracked the sun and moon and displayed the hours for the faithful below. These clocks were marvels of their age, but they were built 1,400 years after the Antikythera mechanism, and their makers had to reinvent everything from scratch. They had no access to whatever tradition had produced the ancient device. The thread of knowledge had been completely severed. This gap, this 1,500-year silence, is one of the most troubling aspects of the Antikythera mystery. The mechanism itself shows no signs of being a prototype or an experiment. The gears are confidently cut. The astronomical cycles are accurately encoded. The inscriptions are professionally engraved. Everything about it suggests a mature technology, the product of a long tradition of development and refinement, not a lucky one-time invention by an isolated genius. Where did that tradition come from? Where did it go? How do you lose the ability to build something like this? The answer, uncomfortable as it may be, is that you lose it through catastrophe, through invasion and conquest, through the burning of libraries and the death of craftsmen, through the slow grinding decline of institutions that once supported specialized knowledge, through all the countless ways that human civilization can stumble and fall and forget what it once knew. We know that much was lost when Rome fell and the Western Mediterranean descended into centuries of instability. We know that the great libraries of the ancient world were destroyed or dispersed, their scrolls scattered or burned or simply crumbling from neglect. We know that craft traditions can disappear in a single generation if there is no one to teach and no one to learn. The Antikythera mechanism is physical proof that the ancient world possessed capabilities we had not imagined, and its uniqueness is physical proof that those capabilities did not survive. Nothing else like it has ever been found. Yet everything about it suggests that it was not alone. Somewhere there were workshops where these devices were made. Somewhere there were masters who trained apprentices in the cutting of gears and the calculation of astronomical ratios. Somewhere there were earlier versions, cruder attempts, failed experiments, incremental improvements over generations. All of that has vanished. Only this one device remains, because it had the strange fortune to be buried in the sea, where the cold and the darkness and the sediment preserved it, while everything on land was burned or melted down or simply lost to time. Think of it as a single page from an encyclopedia, the only page that survived. You can read it, you can marvel at what it contains, but you cannot help wondering about all the other pages, all the knowledge they held, all the questions they might have answered. Those pages are gone. They are not hidden somewhere waiting to be found. They are simply gone, and we will never know what they said. This is the shadow that falls across the Antikythera mechanism, the melancholy that accompanies our wonder. We are looking at a survivor, a lonely artifact from a technological tradition that otherwise perished completely. And if this tradition existed and vanished without a trace, what else might have existed? What other capabilities might the ancient world have possessed that we have simply forgotten because no physical evidence survived? These are not comfortable questions. They unsettle our confident narratives about the steady march of progress from primitive past to sophisticated present. They remind us that history is not a smooth upward curve, but a jagged line with peaks and valleys, advances and collapses, knowledge gained and knowledge lost. And they invite us, gently, to hold our own certainties a little more lightly, to remember that our descendants may look back at us with the same mixture of wonder and puzzlement with which we regard the maker of the Antikythera mechanism. Let these thoughts settle now, like sediment drifting to the ocean floor. The mechanism kept its secrets for 2,000 years. Another few minutes of mystery will not matter. To understand how such a thing could be built and how such knowledge could disappear, we must travel further back to the workshops of ancient Greece, to the libraries of Alexandria, to a world that gleamed with bronze and burned with curiosity. Let yourself drift now across the centuries as we explore the civilization that could produce such wonders and then somehow lose them. To understand how the Antikythera mechanism came to exist, we must travel back across the centuries to a world that hummed with intellectual energy and mechanical wonder. A world where philosophy and engineering walked hand in hand through marble colonnades and bronze-scented workshops, and where the boundaries between science and art had not yet hardened into the divisions we know today. Let yourself drift now into the warm Mediterranean light of the Hellenistic age, that remarkable period stretching from the death of Alexander the Great in 323 BCE to the Roman conquest of Egypt in 30 BCE. Nearly 3 centuries during which Greek culture spread across the known world and blossomed into forms of sophistication that would not be matched again for over 1,000 years. This was the age of the great libraries and the legendary engineers, or the age when human beings first began to build machines that mimicked the motions of the heavens, and when philosophers debated whether the cosmos itself might be understood as a vast mechanism turning according to mathematical laws. In the cities of this scattered Greek world, from Syracuse in Sicily to Alexandria in Egypt to the island of Rhodes gleaming in the Aegean Sea, workshops filled with the sound of hammers on bronze and the patient scraping of files as master craftsmen shaped gears and dials and delicate pointer hands, passing down techniques from father to son and from master to apprentice in unbroken chains of knowledge that stretched back generations and would continue forward until catastrophe finally severed them. And it is here, in these workshops and libraries and academies, that we find the world that made the Antikythera mechanism possible. Consider first the legendary figure of Archimedes of Syracuse, who lived from roughly 287 to 212 BCE, and whose name has become synonymous with ancient genius. We remember Archimedes today primarily as a mathematician, the man who calculated pi to remarkable precision and who discovered the principles of buoyancy and the lever. But to his contemporaries, he was equally famous as an engineer and inventor of mechanical wonders. The ancient sources tell us that Archimedes designed war machines that terrorized the Roman fleet during the siege of Syracuse, cranes that could lift ships from the water and drop them, mirrors that some claimed could focus sunlight to set vessels ablaze, and catapults of unprecedented power and accuracy. But beyond these weapons of war, Archimedes was said to have built something far more delicate and wonderful, a bronze sphere that reproduced the motions of the sun and moon and planets, a working model of the cosmos that you could hold in your hands and watch the heavens dance. The Roman orator Cicero, writing more than a century after Archimedes died, claimed to have seen this very device brought to Rome as plunder after Syracuse fell. Cicero described it with wonder, marveling that a single rotation of the sphere would show the moon rising just as it did in the actual sky, would track the sun through the zodiac, would even predict eclipses with uncanny accuracy. If Cicero's account is accurate, and there is no particular reason to doubt it, then Archimedes built a device remarkably similar in function to the Antikythera mechanism, more than a century before that corroded treasure sank beneath the waves. This suggests that the mechanism was not a singular miracle, but rather an example of an established tradition, one device among many in a lineage of celestial models stretching back at least to the time of Archimedes and possibly earlier still. But Archimedes did not work in isolation. He was part of a broader culture of mechanical innovation that flourished throughout the Hellenistic world, a culture that delighted in automata and moving statues and devices that seemed to blur the line between the living and the made. Ancient sources describe mechanical theatres where tiny figures acted out entire mythological dramas, powered by falling weights and flowing water and systems of strings and levers hidden from view. They described temple doors that swung open without human touch when a fire was lit on the altar, the heat causing air to expand and push water through hidden pipes that turned the door pivots with a force that must have seemed divine to worshippers who did not understand the mechanism. They describe statues that poured wine or milk from vessels that never seemed to empty, birds that sang when the sun rose, and figures that moved their arms and turned their heads as if coming to life. These were not myths or exaggerations, but real machines. And we know this because one of the engineers who built them wrote detailed instructions that have survived to the present day. His name was Heron of Alexandria, and he lived in the 1st century of the Common Era, roughly a century after the Antikythera mechanism was built. Heron was a teacher and an engineer, and he wrote extensively about pneumatics, which is the use of air pressure to create motion, about mechanics, about the construction of automata, and about the mathematical principles underlying all of these arts. His books read like instruction manuals for building wonders. Here is how to make a trumpet sound when a door is opened. Here is how to make a fountain that starts and stops automatically. Here is how to create a miniature theatre where Dionysus pours wine and panthers dance and tiny figures move about the stage. The survival of Heron's writings is one of those accidents of history that allows us to glimpse a world otherwise lost, for Heron was surely not unique. He was drawing on traditions that preceded him by centuries, and that must have been documented in other books that did not survive. When we read Heron, we are seeing one small window into a vast edifice of mechanical knowledge, most of which has crumbled into dust. And then there was Hipparchus of Nicaea, who lived from approximately 190 to 120 BCE, and who is remembered as perhaps the greatest astronomer of antiquity. Hipparchus compiled the first comprehensive star catalogue in the Western tradition, mapping the positions of more than 800 stars with remarkable precision. He discovered the precession of the equinoxes, the slow wobble in Earth's axis that causes the positions of stars to shift gradually over centuries. He developed trigonometry as a tool for astronomical calculation. In the end, he refined the prediction of eclipses to an accuracy that would not be surpassed for over 1,000 years. When modern researchers analyzed the astronomical data encoded in the Antikythera mechanism, they found that it matched the theories and calculations of Hipparchus with striking precision. The lunar anomaly tracker in the mechanism, the part that accounts for the varying speed of the moon as it travels along its slightly elliptical orbit, uses a mathematical model that Hipparchus developed. The eclipse prediction system matches the Babylonian astronomical tables that Hipparchus studied and improved. This suggests either that Hipparchus himself had a hand in designing such devices, or that the tradition of celestial mechanisms was closely linked to the astronomical work of his school. Either way, neither the mechanism emerges not as a mysterious anomaly, but as the product of a specific intellectual tradition, a physical embodiment of cutting-edge astronomical theory translated into bronze and gear teeth. We should also consider Posidonius of Rhodes, the philosopher and polymath who lived from approximately 135 to 51 BCE, and who made the island of Rhodes one of the intellectual centers of the Mediterranean world. Posidonius was famous in antiquity for the breadth of his learning, writing on philosophy, history, astronomy, geography, mathematics, and natural phenomena. Cicero, who studied with Posidonius, mentions that the philosopher possessed a celestial sphere, or orrery, similar to the one attributed to Archimedes, a device that showed the motions of the heavenly bodies. Rhodes itself was renowned for its metalwork and its mechanical arts. The island had grown wealthy from trade and had developed sophisticated craft traditions, and some scholars believe that the Antikythera mechanism was manufactured there. If so, Posidonius and his circle may have had direct connections to the workshops that produced such devices, may even have helped design or commission them. The mechanism would then be understood not as the secret project of a lone genius, but as the product of an institutional culture, a collaboration between philosophers who understood the heavens and craftsmen who knew how to translate that understanding into working bronze. This brings us to the workshop culture itself, the practical foundation upon which all these wonders rested. In the ancient world, as in the medieval and early modern periods, nice specialized crafts were passed down through apprenticeship systems that preserved and gradually improved technical knowledge over many generations. A young man would enter a workshop as a boy, learning first the simple tasks, the sweeping and the fetching, then gradually being trusted with more demanding work, the polishing and the finishing, until after years of training, he had absorbed through his hands and eyes the skills that no book could fully teach. The master craftsmen who built devices like the Antikythera mechanism were the inheritors of centuries of accumulated technique, small improvements building upon small improvements until the tradition reached levels of precision that still astonish modern engineers. The gear teeth in the mechanism are cut with accuracy, measured in fractions of a millimeter, a precision that implies specialized tools and techniques developed specifically for this kind of work. Someone had to invent those tools. Someone had to figure out how to divide a circle into exactly 223 parts for the main gear, how to cut each tooth to mesh perfectly with its neighbors, how to mount the gears on axles that would turn freely without excessive wobble or friction. These were not problems that could be solved in a single lifetime. They required the accumulated wisdom of a craft tradition, handed down from master to apprentice like a precious inheritance. And these craftsmen did not work in isolation from the philosophers and astronomers. The Hellenistic world was notable for the integration of theoretical and practical knowledge, the collaboration between those who thought about the cosmos and those who worked with their hands. Wealthy patrons funded both philosophical schools and mechanical workshops, understanding that wonder and wisdom went together, that a working model of the heavens was both a philosophical statement about the nature of the cosmos and a demonstration of human skill and ingenuity. The mechanism was expensive to produce and served no obvious practical purpose in the way that a water pump or a siege engine would. It was a luxury item, a conversation piece, a tool for contemplation and teaching, and perhaps for impressing guests at symposia, where educated men gathered to drink wine and discuss the nature of reality. This means there was a market for such devices, patrons willing to pay the substantial cost of their manufacture, which in turn means there were workshops that specialized in producing them. The Antikythera mechanism may be unique among surviving artifacts, but it was almost certainly not unique in its own time. It was one of many, perhaps one of dozens or hundreds, produced over the centuries of the Hellenistic age for wealthy collectors and royal courts across the Mediterranean world. This is the world that made the mechanism possible, a world of brilliant astronomers who mapped the heavens with unprecedented precision, of engineers who delighted in building machines that mimicked life and motion, of craftsmen whose skills had been honed over generations, and of wealthy patrons who brought all these elements together in the service of wonder. It was a world of intellectual confidence, of the belief that human reason could comprehend the cosmos and that human hands could build models of its workings. And it was a world that would not last. Let us turn now to the question of what happened to this tradition, how this remarkable body of knowledge came to be lost, and why we are left with only fragments and mysteries where once there was understanding. The loss of ancient knowledge is one of the great tragedies of human history, and nowhere is this loss more poignant than in the fate of the Library of Alexandria. Founded around 300 BCE by Ptolemy I, one of the generals who divided Alexander's empire among themselves, the library was conceived as an institution unlike any that had existed before. A universal repository of human knowledge, a collection that would include every book worth preserving, gathered from every corner of the known world. Ships arriving in Alexandria's harbour were searched for books, which were confiscated, copied, and only sometimes returned. Agents were sent throughout the Mediterranean to purchase or acquire texts of every kind. At its height, the library may have contained between 400,000 and 700,000 papyrus scrolls, the largest concentration of written knowledge in the ancient world. But the library was more than a collection of books. Attached to it was the Mouseion, the Temple of the Muses, which functioned as something like a modern research university. Scholars from across the Greek world were invited to Alexandria, given salaries and housing and access to the collection, and expected in return simply to think and write and teach. Euclid composed his elements of geometry there. Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the Earth. Aristarchus proposed that the Earth orbited the Sun more than 17 centuries before Copernicus. For 3 centuries, Alexandria was the intellectual capital of the Western world, and its library was the treasure house that made this flourishing possible. What happened to the library has been the subject of myth and argument for centuries. The popular imagination pictures a single catastrophic fire, usually attributed to Julius Caesar's troops in 48 BCE, or to Christian mobs in the 4th century, or to Arab conquerors in the 7th. The historical reality is more complex and in some ways sadder. There was no single destruction, but rather a long decline, centuries of gradual erosion during which the collection shrank and the institution weakened until nothing remained. Caesar's fire did destroy part of the collection, probably books stored in warehouses near the harbour rather than the main library itself. The main library survived, diminished into the Roman period, but it faced new threats. Roman administration cared less about funding Greek scholarship. Christian authorities viewed pagan learning with suspicion and sometimes hostility. The famous murder of the mathematician and philosopher Hypatia by a Christian mob in 415 CE, though not directly connected to the library, symbolizes the changing intellectual climate of late antiquity. By the time Arab armies conquered Egypt in 641 CE, there was probably little left of the original collection. The library died not in a dramatic blaze, but in a long, slow fading. Books crumbling from age and neglect are not replaced because no one thought to fund the copyists, until one day the shelves were bare and no one could remember exactly when the last scroll had turned to dust. The loss of the library matters because it represents the loss of an entire intellectual world. We possess today perhaps 1% of ancient Greek literature, perhaps less. We have the works that happened to be copied often enough to survive the transitions from papyrus to parchment to paper, the translations from Greek to Arabic to Latin that preserved some texts through the medieval period, the random accidents of archaeology that occasionally return a charred scroll or a buried codex to the light. But for every text that survived, 100 were lost, and we can only guess at what they contained based on titles mentioned by other authors, quotations preserved in later works, and the tantalizing references that suggest traditions of knowledge we can barely imagine. Consider what we know we have lost. The 40-odd plays of Aeschylus, of which only 7 survive. The complete works of Sappho, of which we have only fragments. The lost books of Livy's History of Rome, 107 books out of 142. Now consider the technical literature, the engineering manuals and astronomical tables, and mathematical treatises that were surely written, but that no one thought important enough to copy through the difficult centuries of late antiquity and the early medieval period. Heron's books survived because someone in Byzantium found them interesting enough to copy. How many similar works by other engineers were simply allowed to crumble away? The Antikythera mechanism invites us to contemplate this loss in concrete terms. Here is a physical object that embodies astronomical and mechanical knowledge of remarkable sophistication. Somewhere, surely, there were texts that explained how to build such devices, manuals that passed down the craft tradition in written form, treatises that discussed the astronomical theories encoded in its gears. None of them have survived. We have the object itself, rescued from the seafloor by accident. But the textual tradition that created it has vanished almost entirely. It is as if a future civilization possessed a single smartphone, perfectly preserved, but had lost all knowledge of electronics, programming, telecommunications, and manufacturing. They could describe what they saw, could marvel at its complexity, but they could not truly understand it because the context had been erased. This is our situation with the mechanism. We can analyze its gears and reconstruct its functions, but the tradition of thought and practice that produced it is largely invisible to us, glimpsed only in fragments and implications. The loss of the Library of Alexandria is the most famous example of knowledge destruction, but it is far from unique. The pattern repeats throughout human history, each catastrophe closing doors that may never reopen. The Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BCE, when civilization throughout the eastern Mediterranean fragmented and fell, erased writing systems and destroyed palace economies, and ended traditions of craftsmanship that had flourished for centuries. The fall of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century CE led to the loss of vast amounts of technical knowledge, from the secret of Roman concrete to the ability to maintain the great aqueducts and roads. The Mongol destruction of Baghdad in 1258 CE devastated the House of Wisdom and ended the golden age of Islamic science. The Spanish destruction of Mesoamerican codices in the 16th century erased nearly all written records of Maya and Aztec civilization, burning the accumulated wisdom of cultures that had developed sophisticated mathematics, astronomy, and engineering entirely independent of the Old World. Time and again, what human beings laboriously built up over centuries was swept away in a few years or decades, and the survivors were left to start over, often unaware of what their ancestors had known. This is the broader pattern into which the Antikythera mechanism fits. It is not evidence of a mythical lost civilization like Atlantis, not proof of ancient astronauts or forgotten golden ages. It is something more unsettling and more real. A reminder that knowledge is fragile, that what one generation builds the next may lose, that the arc of history does not necessarily bend toward progress. The mechanism was built by people who inherited centuries of accumulated wisdom, astronomical observations passed down from the Babylonians, mathematical techniques developed by Greek geometers, metalworking skills refined over generations. All of this came together in their hands, and they created something wonderful. And then, within a few centuries, the thread was cut. The workshops closed, the texts were lost, the skills were forgotten. When medieval Europeans finally began building astronomical clocks in the 14th century, they were reinventing from scratch what the ancient Greeks had already achieved. They did not know they were walking a path that had been walked before. The Antikythera mechanism lay on the seafloor, unknown and silent, a message from a world that had been forgotten. Imagine a library where every book you see is a survivor of a dozen fires. Every page represents 100 pages lost. Every idea you encounter is surrounded by the shadows of ideas you will never know. Questions that were answered and answers that were questioned in books that no longer exist. The Antikythera mechanism is like a single page from an encyclopedia of wonders. The only page that survived the burning of the library, the flooding of the archive, the long centuries of neglect. We can read this one page and marvel at what it tells us, but we must also grieve for the volumes that would have given it context, the chapters that would have explained its origins and its descendants, the footnotes that would have connected it to the broader tradition of which it was a part. It is a treasure, yes, but it is also a wound, a reminder of how much we have lost and how much we will never recover. And yet, there is gratitude mixed with the grief. The mechanism survived. Against all odds, it survived the shipwreck that scattered the treasures of the ancient world across the seafloor, survived 2,000 years of saltwater corrosion that reduced bronze to green paste, survived the indifference of early archaeologists who saw only a lump of corroded metal. It survived the wars and upheavals that might have scattered or destroyed it. It waits now in its case in Athens, and we can study it with technologies its makers never imagined, peering inside with X-rays and CT scans to read inscriptions that have not been seen by human eyes since the day the device was assembled. We can learn from it, can reconstruct its functions, can even build working replicas that turn as smoothly as the original once did. The knowledge it embodies is not entirely lost. It has been recovered painstakingly through the patient work of scholars and engineers who refused to believe that the ancients were as limited as we had assumed. And this recovery invites us to reconsider everything we thought we knew about the past. The traditional narrative of technological history imagines ancient people as intelligent but primitive, capable of building impressive structures through brute labor, but lacking the sophisticated engineering that characterizes the modern world. The Antikythera mechanism challenges this narrative directly. Here is a device that uses differential gearing, a technology supposedly invented in the 16th century. Here is a device that models the elliptical motion of the moon, a phenomenon not mathematically described until Kepler in the 17th century. Here is a device whose precision rivals that of 18th century clockwork, built 2,000 years earlier. The evidence is incontrovertible. Ancient civilizations possessed technical capabilities far beyond what the traditional narrative allows. This does not mean they had electronics or nuclear power or any of the other trappings of modern technology. It means they were master craftsmen who pushed the limits of what could be achieved with bronze and hand tools. It means they were sophisticated astronomers who understood the patterns of the heavens in mathematical detail. It means they were creative engineers who found solutions to problems we assumed they never faced. They were, in short, people like us, working with different tools but with the same intelligence and curiosity and determination. The Antikythera mechanism is not the only evidence of this hidden technical sophistication. Roman concrete, which has endured for 2,000 years, while modern concrete crumbles after decades, used a formula that we are only now beginning to understand: Greek fire. The incendiary weapon of the Byzantine Empire was so effective and so secret that its formula was lost entirely and remains unknown to this day. Precision optical lenses found at ancient sites suggest capabilities in glassworking that were supposedly impossible before the modern era. The Baghdad battery, a clay jar containing a copper cylinder and iron rod that could theoretically generate a small electric current, hints at electrochemical knowledge in ancient Mesopotamia. The Nazca lines of Peru, vast geoglyphs visible only from the air, demonstrate sophisticated planning and execution by a culture with no apparent means of aerial observation. Each of these artifacts and sites challenges easy assumptions about what ancient peoples could and could not do. None of them require supernatural explanations. All of them demand that we take our ancestors more seriously than we have. This is the civilization we were never told about. Not a mythical Atlantis of crystal towers and flying machines, but the real and documented achievements of real historical peoples who were as brilliant as anyone alive today. They did not have our accumulated scientific knowledge or our advanced materials or our electronic tools, but within the constraints of their technology, they achieved wonders that we are only beginning to appreciate. The Antikythera mechanism is a physical proof of this capability, an artifact that cannot be dismissed or explained away, that sits in its museum case and silently testifies to the sophistication of the ancient world. When we look at it, we are looking at evidence of a tradition of mechanical and astronomical knowledge that flourished for centuries and then vanished so completely that when the mechanism was first discovered, scholars literally could not believe it was ancient. It could not be ancient, they insisted, because ancient people could not build such things. But they could. They did. And we are only now beginning to understand what else they might have accomplished, what other wonders might be waiting to be discovered in museum storerooms or on the seafloor, or in the fragments of texts we have not yet learned to read. The paradox of the Antikythera mechanism is this. It exists, physical and undeniable, yet it points to a world that has largely vanished. Either it was the product of a singular genius, or a Leonardo da Vinci of the ancient world, who somehow invented technologies 1,500 years ahead of his time, or it was the product of a broader tradition, a mature craft culture that produced many such devices over many generations. Both possibilities are remarkable. If it was unique, then we must reckon with the existence of a mind capable of leaps of innovation that defy explanation. If it was common, then we must reckon with the loss of an entire technological tradition, workshops and texts and skills that once flourished and then disappeared so completely that only this one survivor remained. Neither possibility is comfortable. Both require us to revise our understanding of what the ancient world was capable of and what we have lost. And neither requires us to invoke aliens or Atlantis or any other mythical explanation. The mundane truth is strange enough. Our ancestors were brilliant, and we forgot. And now, as we drift deeper into this mystery, let us ask the questions that have no certain answers. Let us wonder together about the hands that made this device, the minds that conceived it, and the world that forgot it. The night is deep and the questions are gentle. Let them carry you like waves carrying a ship, like time carrying us all forward into darkness and dreams. What did the craftsman feel when the last gear meshed perfectly and the mechanism came alive in his hands? What did the astronomer feel when he saw the bronze moon tracking across its dial, exactly as the real moon tracked across the sky? What did the captain of the doomed ship feel when he realized his cargo of wonders was sliding into the dark water? We cannot know. We can only wonder. And in the wondering, perhaps we come a little closer to the people who came before us, the people whose genius built the mechanism and whose silence let it be forgotten. They were like us. We are like them. And the thread that connects us across the centuries is made of curiosity and bronze, and the patient light of stars that have been turning since before there were eyes to see them or minds to ask why they moved as they did. Rest now in that connection. Rest in the knowledge that the questions do not require answers tonight. They have waited for 2,000 years. They can wait a little longer while you sleep. Let us drift now into imagination and picture, if we can, the workshop where this device came to be. Somewhere in the Greek world, perhaps on the island of Rhodes, or in the bustling streets of Alexandria. A room filled with soft light filtering through a high window, dust motes suspended in the air like tiny stars, and there, at a wooden bench worn smooth by generations of use, sits a craftsman whose name we will never know, his fingers stained green and brown from years of working bronze, the metal dust embedded in the creases of his hands and beneath his nails, in a permanent testament to his trade. And around him lie the tools of his art, files of varying coarseness arranged in neat rows, compasses with points sharp enough to scratch marks invisible to the casual eye, perhaps a water-filled glass sphere that magnifies the tiny details of his work, and small clay pots containing oils that keep the metal supple and the tools from rusting. The smell of this workshop would have been distinctive and unforgettable. The mineral sharpness of bronze filings mixing with the earthy sweetness of olive oil. The faint char of the small brazier used to warm metal for shaping. And beneath it, all the salt tang of the nearby sea drifting through the window on a gentle Mediterranean breeze. This craftsman did not invent his art alone, but received it as an inheritance, passed down through generations of masters and apprentices. In an unbroken chain stretching back centuries, his own master would have guided his young hands, teaching him to feel when the file was cutting true and when it was binding, showing him how to listen to the metal as it shaped itself under patient pressure. And that master had learned from his master before him, carrying forward techniques refined over lifetimes. The knowledge in those bronze-stained hands was not written in any book, but lived in muscle memory and intuition, in the ability to feel a fraction of a millimeter's difference, in knowing exactly how much pressure would shape the metal and how much would break it. We might imagine him working on a single gear for days or even weeks, each of the 223 teeth requiring individual attention, individual filing, individual testing against its partner gears. And the sound of this work would have been soft and rhythmic. The gentle rasp of file against bronze repeated thousands upon thousands of times. A meditation in metal, a prayer offered up to precision. And in the quiet hours of the morning before the city outside fully awakened, he would have fallen into a trance of concentration where nothing existed except the gear taking shape beneath his hands, and the vision in his mind of how it must mesh with its companions who commissioned such a wonder we cannot know. But we can imagine a wealthy patron, perhaps a philosopher king, or a merchant with intellectual pretensions, someone who wanted to hold the cosmos in their hands, someone who understood that this device would be more than a tool. It would be a statement about human capability, a declaration that the heavens themselves could be captured in bronze and made to dance at the turn of a crank. Perhaps this patron visited the workshop from time to time, standing in the doorway in his fine robes, watching the craftsmen work and marveling at the slow emergence of order from raw metal. Perhaps they discussed the astronomy together, the craftsman asking questions about the cycles he was encoding, and the patron sharing what he had learned from the philosophers and mathematicians. Or perhaps the patron never visited at all, and the craftsman worked from plans drawn up by an astronomer he would never meet, translating mathematical abstractions into physical reality through the alchemy of skill. And we can imagine too the day when the device was finally complete, when the last gear was fitted into place and the craftsman held his breath and turned the input crank for the first time, feeling the resistance of 30 interlocking gears, hearing the soft whisper of bronze teeth engaging, watching as the dials on the front began their slow rotation, tracking the sun and moon through their eternal dance. What pride he must have felt in that moment. What quiet satisfaction in knowing that his hands had built something that would have seemed magical to anyone who did not understand its workings. Something that compressed centuries of astronomical observation into a box that could fit in a man's hands. And perhaps he allowed himself a small smile there in his workshop, alone with his creation, knowing that he had made something that would outlast him, though he could never have guessed by how much or through what strange journey it would travel. The device passed from his hands into the world, and we lose track of it for a time as it moves through the channels of ancient commerce. Perhaps it sat in a private collection for years or decades, brought out to impress guests at symposia, demonstrated by a proud owner who turned the crank and explained the intricacies of its predictions to visitors who nodded in amazement and secretly wondered if it was all some elaborate trick, or perhaps it was a working tool used by astronomers or priests to calculate the timing of festivals and predict the dark days when the sun or moon would disappear from the sky. We cannot know how many hands held it or how many eyes watched its gears turn, but eventually it found its way onto a ship bound for Rome. Packed carefully among bronzes and marbles and all the other treasures that Roman appetite demanded from the conquered Greek world. The ship was large, perhaps 40 meters from bow to stern, heavy with wealth, riding low in the water as it made its way across the wine-dark sea that Homer had sung of 1,000 years before. And for a time the voyage went well, the captain navigating by the same stars that the mechanism tracked, following coastlines and island chains that generations of sailors had memorized. But the Mediterranean is not a gentle sea, and the autumn storms come quickly. We can imagine the day the weather changed, the clouds building on the horizon in towering masses of grey and black, the wind shifting and rising, the first drops of rain striking the deck like small stones. The captain would have known immediately that he was in danger, his ship too heavy to outrun the storm, the nearest harbour too far to reach. And so he would have made the choices that captains in extremis have always made, ordering the crew to reef the sails, to secure the cargo, to pray to whatever gods they trusted. But the storm was stronger than prayers, the waves building until they towered over the deck, the ship groaning as it climbed each mountain of water and plunged down the other side. And somewhere in the darkness of the hold, the mechanism sat in its wooden case, feeling nothing, knowing nothing, while above it, men shouted and struggled against the impossible weight of the sea. Perhaps a wave larger than the others finally struck the hull at an angle it could not withstand. Or perhaps the accumulated stress of hours of battering finally found a weakness in the ancient timbers. But at some moment the ship began to die, water pouring in faster than it could be pumped out, the vessel listing as it took on the weight of the sea, and in those final chaotic minutes, we might imagine the crew abandoning their posts and leaping into the churning water. Or perhaps they went down with their ship as so many sailors have across the long centuries, and the mechanism sank with them, tumbling through the dark water with the bronzes and the marbles and all the other treasures, settling finally on a shelf of rock and sand some 60 meters below the waves. And then there was silence, the profound and absolute silence of the deep sea, where no storms reach and no voices carry, and the mechanism began its long sleep. 2,000 years is almost impossible to comprehend. It is longer than the span between us and the birth of Christ, longer than the entire history of most nations, longer than languages and empires and religions have endured, and yet the mechanism waited through all of it, patient as only the inanimate can be patient, while above it the world transformed beyond recognition. The Roman Republic became an empire that expanded to encompass the entire Mediterranean and then slowly crumbled under its own weight. New religions rose and spread, carrying messages of hope and judgment to every corner of the known world. The Library of Alexandria flickered and faded, as scroll by scroll the accumulated wisdom of antiquity was lost to fire and neglect and simple forgetting. The knowledge of how to build such mechanisms disappeared so completely that later centuries could not even imagine they had existed. Medieval monks copied what ancient texts they could save, preserving some threads of the old learning while others slipped away forever. The Islamic world gathered and translated Greek manuscripts, creating a new flowering of science and mathematics in Baghdad and Cordoba and Cairo. And then the Renaissance brought some of that knowledge back to Europe, where it mingled with new discoveries to create the modern world. Ships powered by engines rather than wind crossed the oceans. Telescopes revealed that the universe was vaster than anyone had dreamed, and devices that could calculate the positions of the heavens were built again without any knowledge that such devices had existed before. And through all of this, through the rise and fall of empires and the birth and death of billions of human beings, the mechanism lay in its cold darkness undisturbed, slowly corroding, its bronze turning green, its gears fusing together as minerals deposited in the thin spaces between teeth, marine life encrusting its surfaces until it looked less like a machine and more like a strange rock, and fish swam through the remains of the ship, and sediment covered the bones of the sailors, and the mechanism waited as if it knew somehow that one day other divers would descend into that darkness and find it, though it did not know and could not know, because it was only bronze and calcium, and the mathematics of ancient astronomers frozen in metal form. But still, we might be forgiven for imagining a kind of patience in that waiting, at a kind of faith that time would eventually bring it back to the light. The Mediterranean Sea holds secrets beyond counting, a basin that has served as the highway of civilization for 5,000 years. its floor littered with the wrecks of Phoenician traders and Greek warships and Roman cargo vessels and Byzantine galleys and Venetian merchantmen and countless others, ships carrying grain and wine and oil and slaves and ideas and treasures from every port of the ancient world. And of these thousands upon thousands of wrecks, only a tiny fraction have ever been explored. Most lie too deep for divers to reach, or too far from known shipping lanes to attract attention, or buried so deeply beneath sediment that no scanner can detect them. And in each of these wrecks, there may be objects as remarkable as the Antikythera mechanism. Other devices that would rewrite our understanding of ancient capability, other treasures that would illuminate corners of the past we cannot now imagine. Even the Antikythera wreck itself has not been fully excavated. Divers have recovered only a portion of what lies scattered across that underwater cliff, and each new expedition finds objects that were missed before. Fragments of bronze and marble and bone that tell their own small pieces of the larger story. And beyond the shipwrecks, there are the libraries, not the great library of Alexandria alone, but countless smaller collections that must have existed in every major city of the ancient world. And though the scrolls have long since rotted away, there is always the chance that somewhere in the dry caves of Egypt or beneath the volcanic ash of Vesuvius, other texts wait to be found. Texts that might explain how the mechanism was built, that might name its creator, that might reveal an entire tradition of mechanical engineering that we currently know only from this single artifact. And this thought is not cause for frustration, but for wonder. We live in a world where the past is not entirely past, where mysteries remain to be solved and wonders remain to be found. And some future generation may know things about our ancestors that we cannot know today, just as we know things that our grandparents could not have imagined when they looked at that corroded lump of bronze in the Athens Museum and wondered what it might have been. Perhaps this is the deepest comfort we can take from the story of the Antikythera mechanism, the reminder that we do not know everything and do not need to know everything. That mystery is not a problem to be solved, but a space to inhabit with humility and wonder. Our ancestors built things we did not expect them to build, understood things we did not expect them to understand, and much of what they knew has been lost, not through malice, but simply through the entropy that claims all things given enough time. And yet, some of it survives, in fragments and ruins, in texts copied and recopied by hands across millennia, in objects like the mechanism that somehow endured the destruction that claimed so much else. And what has been lost may yet be recovered, perhaps not in our lifetimes, but in the lifetimes that follow, because the great wheel of knowledge keeps turning, sometimes forward and sometimes back, sometimes climbing toward understanding and sometimes descending into forgetting, but never stopping entirely, never losing all connection to what came before. We are linked to that craftsman in his workshop by an unbroken chain of human curiosity. We look at the same stars he looked at and wonder the same questions he wondered. And though we cannot shake his hand or hear his voice, we can hold the work of his hands and feel across the gulf of 2,000 years a kinship that death and time cannot entirely erase. The mechanism was built to track the heavens, and in doing so, it tracked something even more profound: the persistence of human wondering, the stubborn insistence on asking how and why, the refusal to accept mystery without at least attempting to understand. And this is our inheritance, as much as any physical artifact. This drive to know, now this willingness to spend months and years of careful work to capture some small piece of the cosmos in bronze, to hold infinity in the palm of a hand, if only for a moment. And so, we come to rest as the mechanism rested for 2,000 years, as the ship rested on the seafloor, as all things rest. When their time of motion has passed, the stars still turn in their ancient courses, the moon still waxes and wanes in its eternal rhythm, and somewhere in museums and in the sea, the past waits patiently to be remembered, to be discovered again by curious minds who are willing to look closely at what others have overlooked. You can let your breath slow now, as the waves slow after a storm. You can let your thoughts grow soft and distant as the light fades in an ancient workshop at the end of a long day's work. The questions will still be there tomorrow, the mysteries will keep, and the thread that connects us to all who came before, the thread of wonder and making and wanting to understand. That thread will not break while you sleep. It has held for thousands of years, and it will hold for thousands more, and you are part of it now, as the craftsman was part of it, as every person who has ever looked up at the night sky and asked, "What is that, and how does it work?" has been part of it. Rest now. Let the gears of your waking mind grow still. Let the mechanisms of thought wind down. The stars are turning without your help tonight. The moon is rising without your attention, and somewhere in the deep Mediterranean, the wrecks of the ancient world keep their patient vigil over treasures not yet found, over secrets not yet told, over wonders that will amaze generations not yet born. And this is enough. This is more than enough. This is the great gift of being human in a universe full of mystery, that we can wonder and not know, that we can question and not answer, that we can rest in the presence of the infinite and trust that understanding will come when it is ready to come. And until then, there is this moment, this breath, this gentle slide into sleep, this connection to everyone who has ever closed their eyes at the end of a day spent wondering about the stars. And so we return now to the present day, to a quiet room in the National Archaeological Museum of Athens, where the fragments of the Antikythera mechanism rest behind climate-controlled glass. Each piece carefully preserved in conditions that keep the ancient bronze stable after its 2,000-year journey through salt water and time and human hands that slowly learned to understand what they were holding. If you were to visit this room, you would find it hushed in the way that sacred spaces are hushed, not because anyone demands silence, but because something about standing before these corroded fragments invites a natural quieting of the voice and the mind. Visitors pause here every day, leaning close to the glass, their breath fogging the surface for just a moment as they try to comprehend what they are seeing, try to bridge the impossible gap between this green and broken thing and the gleaming precision instrument it once was. As some stand for only a moment before moving on to the bronze statues and marble figures that draw larger crowds, but others linger, sensing perhaps that they are in the presence of something that matters in ways that are difficult to articulate. The mechanism is not beautiful in the way the statues are beautiful, not immediately impressive, not something that photographs well or makes for easy conversation. It looks like what it is, which is wreckage, fragments of a whole that can never be fully reassembled, pieces of a puzzle whose edges have been worn away by centuries of salt and pressure and the slow, patient chemistry of decay. And yet, people return to it again and again. Researchers and tourists and schoolchildren on field trips, all of them drawn by the same quiet pull. Nearby, in other museums and universities around the world, are reconstructions of the mechanism turn and click, their modern bronze gears tracing the same celestial paths that the original once tracked. These reconstructions are beautiful in their own way, gleaming and precise, demonstrating for modern audiences exactly what the ancient device could do. Virtual reconstructions exist as well, computer models that can be spun and examined from any angle, that can simulate centuries of celestial motion in seconds, that allow us to peer inside the mechanism in ways its original users never could. The research continues even now as new imaging techniques and new questions lead scholars back to those fragments behind the glass, each examination revealing some small detail that had been missed before, some inscription half worn away, some gear tooth that suggests a function not yet understood. But we still do not know everything about this device, still cannot say with certainty who made it, or exactly where, or precisely why. The questions remain open like doors that lead to rooms we have not yet entered, and perhaps that is as it should be. Perhaps the not knowing is part of what makes this object so powerful, so capable of capturing the imagination across the centuries. The mechanism has become a symbol now, larger than itself, representing all the things we have forgotten and all the things we might yet remember. It stands for the ingenuity of our ancestors, for the fragility of knowledge, for the strange loops of history that bury treasures only to reveal them again to later generations, who must learn all over again what was once common understanding. And if you could stand before that glass tonight, if you could press your palm against the surface and feel the cool smoothness beneath your skin, you would be connected in that moment to every person who has ever stood in that same spot, asking the same questions, feeling the same wonder. You would be connected further still to the craftsman who cut those gears 2,000 years ago, whose fingers knew the weight of bronze and the satisfaction of precision work completed well. You would be connected to the sailors who carried this device across the Mediterranean, not knowing they were carrying the last survivor of a technological tradition that would soon fall silent. You would be connected to the divers who pulled it from the darkness, to the scholars who spent their lives learning to read its secrets, to everyone who has ever looked at the night sky and felt the ancient human need to understand. This is the deepest lesson of the Antikythera mechanism, that we have always been more capable than we remember and more curious than we sometimes admit. The same stars that this device once tracked are still turning overhead tonight, the same moon still waxing and waning through its patient cycles, the same celestial dance continuing as it has for billions of years before humans existed and will continue for billions of years after we are gone. And yet, for a little while, for this brief moment in the long story of the cosmos, there are minds that wonder and hands that build and hearts that yearn to understand. You are part of that ancient inheritance, descended from stargazers and gear makers, from sailors and scholars, on from everyone who ever looked up at the darkness between the stars and asked how and why and what does it mean. That thread of curiosity stretches back further than you know, back through centuries of forgetting and remembering, through libraries that burned and knowledge that was lost. and discoveries that were made again by people who never knew they were rediscovering. And the thread stretches forward too, into futures we cannot imagine, carried by children not yet born who will ask their own questions and build their own instruments and stand in their own moments of wonder before mysteries we cannot yet conceive. Tonight, you rest. Tomorrow, the questions will still be there, patient as they have always been, waiting for minds curious enough to ask them. The mechanism rests too in its glass case in Athens, its gears still at last after all their ancient turning, its secrets partly told and partly kept. The sea keeps its own secrets as well, holding in its depths more wrecks than we will ever explore, more fragments of lost worlds than we will ever recover. And that is all right. That is part of the mystery that makes life beautiful, the knowledge that there is always more to discover, always another door to open, always another question waiting in the darkness for someone to strike a light. Let your breathing slow now. Let your thoughts grow soft and quiet, like the light fading in a museum after closing time. The stars are turning overhead as they have always turned, as the mechanism once predicted they would turn, as they will continue turning long after all our questions have been asked, and answered and forgotten and asked again. You are safe. You are held by the same gravity that holds the planets in their orbits, warmed by the same sun that warmed the faces of ancient astronomers, breathing the same air that has been breathed and exhaled by every human who ever lived. Rest now in that continuity, in that long unbroken thread that connects you to everyone who came before and everyone who will come after. The gears are still. The sea is patient and deep, and somewhere in the darkness between sleeping and waking, the ancient questions wait for you with all the gentleness of starlight falling through 2,000 years of night.